Hey everybody, Professor Jeff here. Glad to see you. So today we are talking about Plato's Republic. So I'm going to be starting with Book 1 today. We're going to get into some of the ideas, the characters, the themes, the setting, as well as like a little general introduction to the work itself. Yeah, let's do this. The Republic itself follows Socrates, as he typically does, going around different areas in Athens, questioning a lot of the more prominent citizens in an attempt to arrive at a better understanding of what Plato referred to as the forms. We'll get more into the forms as it comes up in the course of this research here. Just generally for now, what you need to know is that the forms are basic, abstract, not basic, they're abstract ideals that represent qualities or perfect versions of something, like beauty itself, goodness itself, justice itself. We may see examples of these things, examples of beauty, goodness, and justice, but because they are in our world, they are imperfect and only share in a part of the forms. So one of the major questions in Plato's Republic is, how do we arrive at an understanding of the ideal of justice? Now, that is a big part of what we're talking about in Book 1 today. Just to frame this work in terms of Plato's overall history. So the Republic is one of Plato's middle works. Plato's life work is broken up into three periods. There's his early work, his middle work, and his late work. And these can most basically be understood as a difference in the way that he philosophizes. So in the early and moving into the middle a little bit, we see what is typically known as the skeptical Plato, who uses Socrates as a mouthpiece to question and often deny most ideas that he encounters, and to come away from these interactions maybe in greater doubt about the certainty of his ideas and the ideas held by the Athenian populace at the time. More in the middle and towards the later works, what we see is what a lot of academics believe to be Plato asserting his own ideas about things, using Socrates as a mouthpiece. We'll see, yes, still some of that skepticism that is characteristic of Socrates in his interactions with the citizens of Athens, but we will also see Socrates putting forth some ideas of his own that he believes to be true, such as the forms. Now, again, the Republic is one of the middle works, so this is actually sort of the transitionary period for Plato in his writing, where, again, most people see it as him using Socrates as a character less to question pre-existing ideas and more to assert his own ideas. So we'll just keep that in mind. We'll look at more works of Plato as these video series continue. We'll see some of the earlier works. We'll see some of the later works. Just keep in mind this is a middle work for now. So, to set the stage, because we have to keep in mind, all of Plato's works were written as dialogues. So they're almost like stage plays with characters and settings, which makes them a little fun to read. So coming into Book 1 here, we have Socrates walking with Glaucon. Glaucon is Plato's older brother in real life, historically. Glaucon's a character who comes up a lot throughout Plato's works. That's just kind of fun that he put his brother into these stories. His brother was probably there in real life, but he does make an appearance in the dialogues. So Socrates, Glaucon, Plato, they're walking together, and they're brought to this man, Polemarchus's home. Now, Polemarchus was another prominent philosopher at the time, and the way in which they are invited to Polemarchus's home is with an implicit threat of violence. So at this time, this was actually historically around 375 BC. So it was right around the time of the Peloponnesian War, at which time Athens was actually in the process of being violently taken over by the 30 tyrants. So it was a time of great political upheaval in Athens. This was actually like the beginning of it. Plato's writing about it in retrospect. Keep that in mind. So Socrates was already a controversial figure. I mean, we know from his history that he was put to death for his practice of philosophizing in the public, taking people to task, questioning people about what they believe to be true, and essentially having them prove themselves wrong through a series of questions. This was very irritating to the Athenian citizenry. So they are forcefully, let's say, invited to Polemarchus's home. And there are a couple of people there. One of them is Polemarchus's father, Cephalus. Okay. And another one is Thrasymachus. Now, Thrasymachus was a noted sophist. The sophists are an important group of people at this time, especially with reference to the history of philosophy. The sophists basically had a giant, they were rivals with Socrates, essentially. So Socrates had, what he would do was question the truth, essentially. And he would assert that he doesn't actually know anything. I mean, this kind of goes back to the famous oracle at Delphi story, where Socrates was proclaimed to be the wisest man in all of Athens by the oracle at Delphi, because Socrates asserted that he knew nothing. Okay? He was the only one who knew that he didn't know things. Now, this was different than the sophists. The sophists were essentially a group of traveling teachers. What they would do is they'd actually charge people a lot of money to teach them things like rhetoric, or the art of argumentation, grammar, history, a lot of things that we would consider humanities disciplines at this time. So they were almost like private teachers for hire for a large sum of money. And part of what they would do to showcase their talents was to debate people publicly, much like the way Socrates did. Although, as Socrates was incredibly committed to the pursuit of some kind of truth, which he believed that he never actually arrived at, what the sophists would do is assume an argument or a perspective that they knew they could win a debate with. Okay? They basically just chose the stronger dog in the fight, I guess we could say. If there was an argument that they thought could win a debate, they would espouse that argument in order to win the debate, showcase their talents in argument, and then essentially sell their services to the people who witnessed it. So, the sophists and Socrates, very contentious at the time. So, just setting the stage here. Socrates, Plato's older brother Glaucon, come to Polemarchus, Cephalus, and Thrasymachus's abode, where they begin to have a discussion. Now, keep in mind, Cephalus is Polemarchus's father, so he's quite a bit older than everybody else in the party here. So that's really just the stage is set. These are our characters. This is our setting. None of that really changes too much. What ensues is a discussion of really three big philosophical ideas. The first one being old age. The second being the use of wealth and the benefit of having and accumulating wealth throughout one's life. And the third being a preliminary discussion of justice. What might justice be? What might it not be? Is it a good thing to be just? This is one of the central questions of the entire Republic. So what in book 1 here, again, remember this is all just book 1. We're going to do book 2 soon. We just get an initial sketch of these ideas. So, as Socrates and Glaucon arrive with Polemarchus to his home with their companions, Socrates is warmly greeted by Cephalus, who remarks that he's become too old to walk into town, which is why he summoned Socrates to his home. He would have liked to have this discussion with Socrates, so he summoned him. So Cephalus then remarks that as he's gotten older, his desire for the pleasures of the body have withered. But the desires and pleasures that have to do with speech and discussion, which the Greeks called logos, was actually what they, depending on the school of thought, a lot of them believed that it was the primary way to arrive at a definition of truth, to discuss ideas with others. And through that discussion, you arrive at a greater understanding of truth. So Cephalus says as he's getting older, he cares less about physical pleasures and is enjoying the pleasures of speech, logic, rhetoric, pleasures of the mind, essentially. So that is why he's seeking Socrates out, because Socrates is the best at speaking publicly. So Socrates replies that he enjoys talking with older people because they have more wisdom from walking down a specific path for a longer time than younger people. And Cephalus is happy to explain that he meets with other men of approximately the same age, and many of them mourn the pleasures of their youth, drinking, eating, and specifically sex. But Cephalus says he doesn't share their opinion. He actually relates a story about another Greek poet who, when elderly, was asked if he missed having sex, to which the poet replied he was happy to be rid of the impulse. Cephalus determines that old age isn't what causes a withering of what they call the mad masters of pleasure, but instead an aging and wizening of character. He says specifically, and this is a quote, "If they are orderly and content with themselves, even old age is only moderately troublesome. If they are not, then both age, Socrates, and youth alike turn out to be hard for that sort." So, if you are orderly and content with yourself, whether you are young or whether you are old, it doesn't matter. You will have a better time of things, regardless of if you find pleasures of the body more appealing or pleasures of the mind more appealing. You must achieve an internal harmony, which is going to be an idea that Plato returns to later on in the text here, that we get a better description of. This is really cool stuff. So the idea that people can cause themselves unnecessary harm because of the quality of their character is a common theme that will recur and become clearer throughout the Republic and Plato's work in general. Specifically here, though, we see him argue that while old age is inherently somewhat difficult, it is difficult, purity and strength of character can ease both aging and the relative chaos of youth. So that's really it on old age at this point. They turn to a discussion of wealth. So there is a brief change in the topic of conversation for Socrates and his companions when he asks Cephalus about the nature of money. Again, Socrates turning to the wisdom of an older person. Specifically, he asks if Cephalus has earned or inherited his wealth. And Cephalus replies that he inherited most of his money from his father, who inherited it from Cephalus's grandfather. and he would be happy to increase his family's wealth by a small margin before the end of his life. That is his only aspiration in terms of wealth. Socrates then asks, what do you suppose is the greatest good you have enjoyed from possessing great wealth? This is a question and I'm sure many of the viewers here have asked themselves. Why is wealth important? Is it important? Does it help you in life? Does it actually increase the quality of your life? This relates back to the question of old age, as Cephalus makes a roundabout by saying that as an old man, he fears death and anticipates punishment or reward in the afterlife for his deeds during his mortal life. Money, he says, has allowed him to treat others well without lying or cheating and make adequate sacrifices to the gods during his lifetime. So money, he argues, allows him to live a more just, virtuous, fair, kinder life. Debatable. This is something we could discuss in the comments. Would love to hear what you think. Does money, in fact, allow you to be a better person during life? Not my idea. Plato's. Or at least a question for discussion. So this brings the party to the central discussion throughout the Republic. The nature of justice. Because again, Cephalus argues, as he's older, he worries whether or not he lived a just life, whether or not he will be punished for it in the afterlife or rewarded, and whether or not money has allowed that to be easier for him. So, going forward, the benefits of wealth lead to a cursory definition of justice that goes something like, justice is giving back what one borrows. Socrates refutes this argument, like he typically does, by asking if it is just. He likes these counter examples. It's a very Socratic way of arguing. He asks, is it just to borrow weapons from a person in their right mind and return them when the person is in a maddened state? Cephalus has had enough of this conversation and excuses himself. Socrates turns his questioning to Cephalus' son, Polemarchus. Keep in mind, a seasoned philosopher of the time, not quite of the level of Socrates, but maybe the same quality of some of the sophists. But this idea of justice being giving back what one borrows is now in question. Polemarchus echoes the definition of justice he understands from the famous Greek poet Simonides. He says, justice is to give to each what is owed. Socrates likes this definition initially, but doesn't believe it meshes with his example of someone with an unsound mind. From this example, Polemarchus says we owe something good to friends, so if a madman asks for his weapon back, it is good to deny him. Socrates approves of this addendum, but adds that implies that an enemy is then owed harm by their enemy. Polemarchus doubles down on this definition, saying justice is doing good to friends and harm to enemies. Okay, so if a friend lends you a weapon in their right mind and they ask for it back in a questionable state of mind, you don't give it to them because you want to do good to your friends. And withholding that weapon from your friend when they are in that state of mind is doing them good. An enemy, on the other hand, sure, enjoy that weapon. So, if this is the case, Socrates asks about the context of justice properly exercised, as enemies meet in war and exchange harm. In peacetime, Polemarchus argues that it is used to establish contracts. Justice is for the sake of establishing contracts. Okay, that's Polemarchus's new working definition here. Socrates refutes this, asking whether an expert in a specific domain knows best about their domain, making them better at establishing contracts with respect to their expertise. Polemarchus concedes this function of justice, but maintains that helping friends and harming enemies is the foundation of justice. Socrates will then go on to complicate this matter by proving that sometimes people are mistaken about who their friends and enemies are, in essence arguing that it is sometimes just to harm friends and help enemies. Polemarchus clarifies, establishing that one must both seem to be and actually be a friend in order to receive good. Through a series of examples, such as horses, dogs, musicians, Socrates establishes that any creature who is harmed becomes worse with respect to their function and virtue. Remember that for the Greeks, virtue essentially means a strength or optimal functioning of a thing. So the virtue of the eyes is to see well, the virtue of the ears is to hear well, the virtue of a hammer is to hammer nails very well. Then he argues that human beings who have been harmed necessarily become more unjust, and therefore it is never just to harm anyone, because you are creating a less just person. And when you harm someone, you make them less just. So it is not just to harm enemies, because you're adding to the injustice of the world. This line of reasoning enrages Thrasymachus. He jumps out of his seat and demands that Socrates stop picking apart other people's definitions of justice and actually assert his own ideas. Socrates responds that he doesn't know. He doesn't know much, and he really only seeks to learn from others. And like someone searching for gold among dirt, he has to sift through much dirt before arriving at the truth. Thrasymachus asserts his definition of justice next. He says the just is nothing other than the advantage of the stronger. Socrates takes this definition literally, asking if this means he and his companions should eat the same food as the local wrestling champion, because it would be just to do so. Thrasymachus clarifies, saying that this essentially means following the laws of an established ruling body. For him, justice means the ruler setting out laws, whether democratically or tyrannically, doesn't actually matter for Thrasymachus, and citizens following those laws. If a citizen breaks a law, then that is injustice. If a citizen follows a law, that is justice, following the larger ruling body. Socrates has 2 points of critique regarding this argument. First, he asks whether or not rulers can make mistakes about what is advantageous and how that is put into law. Thrasymachus admits this is possible. Socrates then asserts this means that the pure obedience which characterized his definition means both the advantage and the disadvantage of the ruler. So if a ruler makes a law that does not benefit the people, the city, the state, the ruler themselves, is it still just for the populace to obey that rule? Thrasymachus revises his argument, saying a ruler is only truly a ruler when enacting correct laws, which are to their advantage and the advantage of the people they govern. Socrates proceeds by analogy here. He asks if a doctor works for their own advantage. Thrasymachus replies that the doctor works for the advantage of a sick patient. Socrates asks the same about the captain of a ship and horse breeders, whether they act for their own advantage. To which Thrasymachus responds, no, they work for the advantage of sailors and horses for whom they are responsible. Then Socrates concludes that rulers and leaders work not for their own advantage, but for the advantage of the ruled and the led. He goes so far to say that A city full of good and virtuous people would fight over who is not to be the ruler, as opposed to the current situation in their republic, where people fight over who is to rule because they see it as advantageous for themselves. This is because a virtuous person knows that the role of a ruler is to benefit a large number of people besides themselves. However, Socrates believes one situation could compel a good man to lead, and that is the fear of being ruled by a lesser man. At this, Thrasymachus changes the course of the argument entirely by stating that the just act so as to benefit the stronger, meaning larger, higher ruling body, and the unjust act so as to benefit themselves. Due to this, Thrasymachus believes the unjust person benefits more from their actions than the just person. We're now at a common argument used even today, which suggests that evil people benefit from their actions, and the moral or just person is ultimately harmed because of their commitment to being good. What follows is actually a bit of a strange defense of justice as virtue and injustice as vice on Socrates' part. While Thrasymachus continues to argue that justice is vice or weakness and injustice is virtue and strength, Socrates stops him and asks if the just man attempts to get the better of another just man, to which Thrasymachus responds in the negative. He then asks if the unjust man will attempt to get the better of both the just and unjust, to which Thrasymachus says yes. Right? Just people are not going to try to get one over on other just people. They will, in fact, try to stop unjust people and get the better of them. Unjust people will try to get the better of both the just and the unjust. As has been his habit in this section, Socrates argues by analogy, prompting questions about musicians, doctors, and the generally well-educated. He asks if these people will try to get the better of a good musician, doctor, and student, respectively, which Thrasymachus must deny. However, the poor musician, doctor, and student will try to get the better of both their betters and their worse-off counterparts. As the lesser versions of the doctors, musicians, etc., resemble the unjust person who tries to get the better of both the just and the unjust, they more closely resemble an unlearned person, and since the just will only attempt to get the better of the unjust, they resemble the well-educated person. Socrates uses this as a way to align justice with knowledge and virtue, and injustice with ignorance and vice. Socrates goes on to ask Thrasymachus if an unjust city would conquer and take a just city's population as slaves. Okay? Would an unjust city conquer and take a just city's population as slaves? Thrasymachus says, of course. Socrates then asks if a just city would do the same to an unjust city, which Thrasymachus says, yeah, sure, they would. However, Socrates then argues that injustice in a city, like in a person, divides and creates tension among the parts of the whole. Specifically, he says of injustice, this is a direct quote again, wherever it comes into being, it first of all makes that thing unable to accomplish anything together with itself due to faction and indifference and difference. And then it makes that thing an enemy both to itself and to everything opposite and to the just. He says the unjust man is both an enemy to himself and the gods, who take personal issue with injustice. To assert his final critique of Thrasymachus, Socrates asks if different objects have different purposes to which they are suited. For example, knives for cutting, horses for laboring, ears for hearing, eyes for seeing. Then insofar as each of these objects are good at their job, they possess virtue. Virtue is nothing more than the specific strength of ability for the function that rightly belongs to an object. Socrates then goes on to say that the virtue of a soul is justice, and a person's soul is most virtuous when just, imputing goodness, happiness, and wealth onto that person's life, right? Because it suggests a harmony of parts. Yet in true Socratic fashion, he ends the discussion by thanking Thrasymachus for his considerations and claiming he still doesn't know about the truth of justice, which is to take up a bulk of the rest of the work. And so to recap real quick, the first book of Plato's Republic analyzes 3 distinct topics, okay? The experience of aging, the relative benefit of wealth, and justice. What it is, does it help us? So while the first 2 are fairly straightforward, Plato has characters discuss several facets of the concept of justice, which will be addressed later in the work. Next video will be diving more into that. That is it for today. Thank you so much for joining. Let me know in the comments if you think that the just life is weaker than a life of injustice. Subscribe to be notified for book 2, and I'll see you next time. Later.